Good afternoon to you. I'm Merv Wyeth and I'm Secretary to APM's Benefits Management Specific Interest Group. Today's presentation marks the fifth in our series of APM's Strengthen Your Knowledge campaign for effective benefits management. And today we're going to explore the link between strategy, project delivery and benefits. So our webinar is entitled Applying PRUB-thinking to Change Initiatives, Who is Accountable for What? And our presenter, who will join us very shortly, is Phil Driver. Applying PRUB-thinking to change initiatives. And here you can pretty much read this for yourself, but in case you're not able to see it, during Phil's visit back in 2015, Phil provided compelling and controversial evidence that most strategies have little or no impact. However, by using his PRUB method, it's possible to craft validated strategies that really do make a difference. He continues to develop his PRUB thinking in various sectors and mainly in Australia and New Zealand. And in this webinar, Phil will share some new insights into how PRUB thinking clarifies accountabilities from the initial stakeholder engagement stage through project delivery to contract and performance management. And so a little bit about Phil Driver. Phil is the founder and CEO of OpenStrategies Ltd, and that is based in Christchurch in New Zealand. He has a background in science and engineering management that led to his involvement in large-scale industry sector strategies, and this in turn led to an in-depth understanding of the challenges of an even larger scale in terms of public sector strategies. The OpenStrategies business system evolved through more than a decade of intense engagement with many public and private sector organizations. And a fundamental principle of Phil's work is that anyone can design a complicated strategy system, but it takes a good designer to develop a simple one. In 2014, Phil published his first book, Validating Strategies, linking projects and results to uses and benefits, hence PRUB, which he brought to life during his visit to the UK in November of that year. He's finalizing his next book. So with that, Phil, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar. Right, what I want to run through today is to reintroduce the concept of PRUB-thinking, which I did discuss in an earlier webinar. I'll then use that thinking to introduce the concept of what I call PRUB accountability. And then I'll just very briefly touch on this idea of OpenStrategies commissioning for impact, which will just briefly touch on what's going to be in my next book. So the first question I'd like to address is why do most strategies make no difference? And there's many different reasons, but one we have found overwhelming is the complexity of the strategy language. Now, many of the strategy projects that I get involved in involve large numbers of stakeholders. So we may have 50 or 100 different organizations trying to work together. So it may be an anti-obesity strategy. I'm doing work in Sydney on a vulnerable children strategy, where we have many different stakeholders from the Ministry of Health, from the police, from social work, from education and so on. And if we're going to get many stakeholders to work together, we have to have simple language. And this is the sort of problem we get in some of the strategies we start with, is what I call the taxonomy, the syntax and the semantics. So if we look at those words under the word taxonomy, I've found all of those words in a single government strategy document. And the challenge there is that many people have different meanings for the words like outputs or outcomes or goals. If we look at the syntax, do goals create objectives or do objectives create goals? And really there is no clarity, there's no agreement on those issues. So over the last 15 to 20 years, we've developed a strategy system that is extremely succinct. And we have a rule that says a strategy should contain the smallest amount of strategic information that has the highest value to the most people. So we don't do strategies that are perfect for an accountant or perfect for an engineer. We create strategies that all stakeholders can understand. So what should a strategy actually do? A strategy should guide the improvement of what organisations do. So what do organisations do? And here's the answer. If you read along the bottom there, organisations create assets. They enable people to use the asset to create benefits. And I'm going to give you some examples of that sequence. But a simple one is create an asset could be build a bridge and enable people to use the bridge. And that use creates the benefit of a person, for example, being at work on time. So we capture that sequence of create assets and enable people to use assets to create benefits in the sequence PRUB. Projects create results that get handed over to a user, which generates benefits. So here's a couple of really simple examples. Project, manufacture and market our products. The result is the product is available to end users. The uses, customers buy the product, and the benefits are happy customers and a sustainably profitable business. Another simple example, build a cycleway. Result, we've got a cycleway. The use, children ride on it. The benefit, they're safe. PRUB is useful for both planning and implementation. And we have found that the planning or the thinking should burp, in other words, understand benefits, uses, and they will guide results and projects. And then implementation, you simply go back the other way. And over many years, we've actually found that the most useful piece of information and the best place to start is to understand uses. So when we engage with stakeholders, we never ask them, what do you want? We always ask them, what do you want to do? And why do you want to do it? So what do you want to do? That's generating information about the uses. Why do you want to do it? Generates information about the benefits. So when you understand uses and benefits, usually the results become very obvious. In an ideal world, you run a project, it produces a result, somebody uses it and you get a benefit. The reality is that an awful lot of projects produce results that we call abandoned orphan results. They're results that nobody uses and they simply get abandoned. There's another type of orphan result where you run a project that produces a result that doesn't get used by the end user, but gets adopted by another project to produce a second result that does get used. So let's look at an example of that. Here we have a project for a company to design a product. The result is a set of designs. Now an end user isn't going to use a design, so the design has to go back into a project to actually build the product and make it available. The second result is the product's available, people use it, and we get the benefits to the end user, and the company is sustainable. There are no shortcuts. In order to be effective, a project must produce a result, and ultimately the result must be used, and that must lead to benefits. A project does not create a use. A project does not create a benefit. A project can only create a result. The result has to be used, and the use leads to a benefit. And this leads to this statement: only uses create benefits. And this can be both sobering and frightening because projects don't create benefits. And I'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. So that's a reminder of PRUB thinking. It's putting initiatives in the sequence of what's the project, what result will be produced, how's it going to be used, and what's the benefit. I'm now going to move on to using this thinking to look at the issue of accountability. So PRUB accountability. There's 4 types of accountability. There's project efficiency accountability. So someone needs to be accountable for the efficiency of a project, the effectiveness of a result, the efficiency of uses, and the effectiveness of a benefit. Now, I won't spend a whole lot of time digging into the details of why efficiency is associated with projects and why effectiveness is associated with results. I'm more than happy to answer questions on that later on, but that is our understanding of accountability. So here it is in the PRUB sequence. If you're going to run a project to produce a result, to generate uses, to create benefits, somebody has got to be accountable for project efficiency. Somebody's got to be accountable for result effectiveness, use efficiency, benefit effectiveness. So there's actually 4 types of accountability. There's another factor here in what I call the levels of accountability. Who's going to be accountable for identifying what parameters we're going to measure? Are we going to measure health? Are we going to measure finance? What are we going to measure? Someone needs to decide what is most important. We then need to contractually specify that, and then someone needs to implement those parameters. So that leads us to a matrix of 16 accountabilities. Here it is. So the accountabilities across the top: project efficiency, result effectiveness, and so on. The types of accountability down the left, and the question mark, who is responsible for each one of those? So who is responsible for even identifying what we're going to measure in terms of project efficiency? Who's going to determine what's most important? So I'm coming down that second column. How's that going to be specified contractually? And who's actually going to deliver the efficiency of a project? So let's look at a very simple example. If we go across the top, there's a project to build a swimming pool, and this is a deliberately simplistic example. The result is a swimming pool, use is children swim in it, the benefit is we've got healthier children. So at the identify level, someone's going to say, okay, we're going to monitor cost and timing. Those are the parameters we're going to look at. And if we come down below that, the next level is to value that. What's the ideal dollars? What's the ideal timeline? Someone's got to come up and be accountable for identifying that. Someone then has to specify the actual practical dollars and timeline that someone's going to be held accountable to. And down at the bottom, someone's then actually got to create those assets. So there's 4 steps in that sequence. If we come across to the swimming pool, it's fairly easy to identify we want a swimming pool. We might then need to value and prioritize the materials, the color, and other necessary infrastructure that might go with that swimming pool. Someone needs to be accountable for that. And I was actually involved in a project in a London borough where they were about to open, in fact, a leisure centre that included a swimming pool. And they were saying children were going to use that. And I said, how are the children going to get to the swimming pool? And they said, by bus. And I said, where are the buses going to park? And they had made no arrangements for anywhere for the buses to park. No one had been accountable for even identifying that issue. So if you look at this matrix, who is accountable for each one of those? And the next slide is one that I would like us to focus on, where P is purchaser and S is supplier. And our analysis is that the first 2 rows, the purchaser is accountable for all of that identification of what needs to be done and prioritizing it. Now, these are default accountabilities. The purchaser might subcontract to a supplier to go and collect information about use efficiency or collect information about a benefit. The starting default accountability in our analysis is that the purchaser is accountable for identifying project efficiency, for identifying result effectiveness, for identifying use efficiency, and identifying benefit effectiveness. They're also accountable for prioritizing those 4 efficiencies. When it comes down to actually specifying those in a contract, our analysis is that the supplier and the purchaser are jointly responsible for specifying effectiveness and efficiency, but the use efficiency and the benefits are actually right outside the control of the supplier. So by default, they need to be specified by the purchaser. Now the purchaser might negotiate with the supplier to say, could you please take over responsibility for that? But if that conversation hasn't been held, then the default accountability rests with the purchaser. If we look at the final line, who's accountable for actually delivery, the supplier can reasonably be held accountable for the project efficiency and the result effectiveness, because they can actually control those. The supplier cannot control the user. They can influence the user, and the purchaser can influence the user. So we would argue that the default accountability for the actual users and for the actual benefits, that default rests with the purchaser. So if your project is to build a swimming pool and you've got a swimming pool, can the people who build the swimming pool be held accountable for the number of children who swim in it? Can they be held accountable for the health of those children? I guess I would be really interested in the questions at the end of this as to whether you accept or reject that assertion that we make, that the supplier or the project manager cannot automatically be held accountable for uses and benefits. So this would somewhat challenge some of the traditional views on benefits realization. I would argue that by default, a supplier cannot realize benefits. Only a use or a user can realize benefits. Now, certainly a supplier who has created the right result, that correct result, if it's well known to the end user, will lead to use efficiency and it will lead to a benefit. But that sequence of the use and the benefit is actually outside the control of the supplier. Okay, so that's PRUB accountability. I'm going to very quickly touch on this concept of commissioning and how PRUB applies to commissioning. So if we take a definition of commissioning being along the lines of building services around the user, so that's all the way from identifying what a user wants or what the use might be, why they want it, what the benefits are, and then actually creating and delivering those services. So all of those things we call commissioning. Let's look at that through the PRUB lens. So PRUB thinking can be used seamlessly through 9 stages of commissioning. So in the first stage, we would argue that PRUB thinking is really useful for understanding uses and benefits. And we overwhelmingly start by asking the end user, what do they want to do, the uses, and why do they want to do it, the benefits. So PRUB thinking guides us to ask those questions about uses and benefits. In the second stage, we then go to the service providers or the project managers and say, here's the uses and benefits that people out there want to do. What can you offer in terms of projects and results that will enable those uses and benefits? So a use might be that people want to go swimming and the benefit is they want to be healthy. So a supplier might come along and say, if that's the use and benefit, we can offer to build a swimming pool. Another service provider might come along and say, we offer to clean up the local river so that people could swim in the river. So by going back to the service provider, we can often get quite unexpected suggestions for results that will enable the use and benefit. So there needs to be engagement with the service providers to come up with creative solutions to the desired use, because the user didn't say, I want to swim in a swimming pool. They said, I want to swim. So stage 2 is drawing on the wisdom of service providers to say, well, what could you offer to enable those uses and benefits? Stage 3 is to string that together if we do this project, we'll get that result, which will lead to this use, which will lead to that benefit. And this is where we add evidence. How do you know that that will actually happen? So some of you may have heard this story before, but it's quite common in a situation like Christchurch in New Zealand after the earthquake, where people were asked, what do you want? And a lot of people said, we want to have more cycleways. So the City Council is going ahead and building cycleways. I would argue that the wrong question was asked. Instead of saying, what do you want? And people saying, I want a cycleway, we should have said, what do you want to do? And the answer is people want to get to work on time. And when we mention cycleways, the reply is often that, yes, it would be a good cycleway because then everybody else would ride on the cycleway and that would reduce congestion, so therefore I could drive my car to work. So if people say they want a cycleway, we need to find out, will they really use it or do they want everybody else to use it? So stage 3 in our 9-stage sequence is using the PRUB-thinking to say it might be a logical sequence, but where's the evidence that it will really happen? So step 3 is validating the truth of the sequence. Step 4 is developing a business case. So that's looking at, is it worth it? Does the value of the benefits exceed the cost of the projects plus the cost of the uses? Because very often the uses may be the cost of the uses may be a bigger cost than the cost of the projects. So if you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis, we need to know the net value of the benefits compared to the net cost of the projects plus uses. And we could have a quite separate conversation about putting values on social benefits, but I won't go into that at the moment. The PRUB-thinking is very useful for saying we need to look at the cost of the projects, we need to look at the cost of the uses, we need to look at and put a value on the benefit. So it's providing the logic to that sequence. The next step is to make a funding decision. And very often in our work, we may end up with 20 or 30 competing initiatives and only enough money for 5 of them. If each of those initiatives is presented as a sub-strategy, so that's as a PRUB sequence, it makes it very easy to compare the different sub-strategies. We can compare the logic of them, we can compare the quality of the evidence for each of the sub-strategies, and we can compare the value of each of those sub-strategies using PRUB-thinking. If we've got a sub-strategy that shows the logical sequence of, we might have 5 projects creating 8 results being used in 3 ways to create 10 benefits, that sub-strategy provides a very robust basis for creating a contract, because it makes it clear we want these projects, these results, these uses and benefits, and the accountabilities can be attached to each of those as per my previous comments about PRUB accountability. Following that, it comes down to implementing strategy. So if our strategy is in the form of a PRUB sequence, you just go ahead and do it. You've defined the projects, the results, the uses, benefits, you know what the accountabilities are for those, you've got the evidence that they're going to work and that they're worth it. Monitoring and managing performance, that comes back to the PRUB accountability. We monitor and manage the efficiency of the projects, the effectiveness of the results, the efficiency of the uses and the effectiveness of the benefits. And at the end of the day, we might review and update the entire strategy and say, well, look, it kind of delivered the goods, but we actually want to now change the entire strategy. We might want to add a couple of extra projects. We might have built a beautiful swimming pool. No one's using it because nobody knows anything about it. So we might need to come back and add in a project around marketing. So that's all I want to go through on the commissioning model. I'm just showing how PRUB-thinking, you can use that same thinking as you go through every single step. So instead of using PRUB-thinking in step 1 and different thinking methodologies for step 2, step 3, step 4, this PRUB-thinking flows through seamlessly. And as I said at the beginning, we've developed this PRUB-thinking where you've got a lot of stakeholders having to work together. So for any one of you, you might want to use a different thinking process. But if you want 80 or 100 organisations with perhaps 2,000 people all understanding the same strategy and all being able to work from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, we argue that you need a simple language and a simple system such as this in order to bring everybody on board. Some of you may be familiar with Blaise Pascal's wonderful quote when he wrote somebody a letter. And he said, "I'm sorry I wrote you a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one." Creating a simple, clearly understood strategy is much harder than creating a complex strategy with hundreds of pages. So creating succinct PRUB-based strategy is actually quite difficult. But when you've got a set of sub-strategies together, they're very easy to use. So I'm going to summarize what we've gone through. I touched on PRUB-thinking, which was a topic of an earlier webinar. I showed how PRUB-thinking applied to accountability, and I made some quite strong claims there about who is accountable. And in particular, I put a lot of the accountability back onto the purchaser. You know, far too often I've seen project managers or suppliers being held accountable for something they had absolutely no control over. And so, as project managers, when you're signing a contract, I would encourage you to really challenge what is it that you're going to be held accountable for and what will the purchaser be held accountable for. And if you're going to be held accountable for benefits realization, then be very aware that you can only influence uses and benefits. You cannot control them. So be very wary about accepting accountability for the delivery of benefits. And then finally, I touched on the commissioning for impact. And Merv, I'll hand back to you.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Phil, for that explanation. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
I can hear you well, thank you, Merv.
Okay, just perhaps to address a couple of points that we've got one question regarding the Menti code, so we can still take your observations on that. That's 448757, and that's still open to you. And you will see there's a final slide in there about reflective practice and what you've actually learned from this webinar. So, so do complete that. That's the code. Also, the handout that I put up here, that's one page, and that summarizes something like 7 different resources where you can find out about PRUB. That's really based on Phil's previous visit. So, so that information there. We've got a fair old number of questions that have come in, Phil. I thought in order to answer them, it might be useful if you could go back to the slide really that outlines what PRUB is. So I think that may be about the 5th slide in your deck. And we can really pick up on some of the, perhaps re-emphasize the essence of PRUB and where you're drawing out the different types of accountability. I know, for example, you have used a slide to kind of demonstrate what the scope of what results could be and that sort of thing. So just a quick gallop through what that slide means, that would be helpful, I think, Phil.
So what does PRUB mean? When we were developing the idea of PRUB, we had a whole sequence of words. We had projects, we had words like programs, we had activities, and so on. And we found that the sequence of project, result, use, benefit was the most universally acceptable and understood sequence. So a project is an action, a result is a consequence, it's a thing, it's an asset, it might be a service, it might be a product. A use is an action, people doing something, the benefit is a thing. So it's action, consequence, action, consequence. An absolutely key element here is that projects and results are typically run by one organisation or a group of organisations, and there's what we call a handover to the community or the client group who undertake the use and the benefit. And that change of ownership is absolutely crucial, because you cannot control what the users and the benefits, how they come about. So if you're going to hand a result over to an end user, you better understand what it is they're going to do, and that's why we have those two arrows in the middle there. Before you do the handover, you actually have to do the engagement, which is to really, really understand the uses and benefits. Use that wisdom to guide the projects and results, and then hand it back over to the user. In terms of efficiency and effectiveness, we've found it very, very useful to distinguish between efficiency and effectiveness, and to apply efficiency to projects, because you can have an efficient action, and then to apply the effectiveness to a result. Now, some people have argued that a project can be effective. So a project to build a bridge can be effective in that it builds a really good bridge, but you don't know that it is effective until the bridge has actually been built and is used. So the effectiveness sort of sits either on the result or between the result and the use. The effectiveness is noted or measured at the point where you get to the result. You're not able to measure effectiveness during the project. You can predict effectiveness, but actual effectiveness only turns up when the result is sitting there in front of you. And the same sort of arguments apply to efficiency for projects, efficiency for users, benefit effectiveness. So Merv, does that address your question?
I think it does, Phil. Yeah, I think that's really useful. Okay, just working through some of the questions, and we've got quite a few here. We've got quite a consensus, I think, around agreeing with your assertion here. So this one does start, agree completely. Supplier can't ensure use efficiency and benefits. How do we get the purchaser to buy in and resource this part?
That is one heck of a good question, and I imagine if we got the collective wisdom of everybody who's involved in this webinar, we might be able to pull an answer together on that one. I have found it very, very difficult, and without giving away too much information, one major client I'm working with is reluctant to take on that accountability. However, they are under the serious gaze of the Treasury for this particular country, and Treasury is saying to them, yeah, you as a purchaser are actually accountable for this stuff. How do you know that the projects you're wanting these suppliers to run really will work? And the purchaser is struggling to answer that question. And I have found that problem over and over again. I don't have the answer to force a purchaser to take that accountability, but I can certainly use PRUB to trigger that conversation and sit there with them and let the silences continue when you ask the question. And if they can't answer it, then say, well, do you want me to take over accountability for the uses and the benefits, because I can influence them? And I'm happy to be held accountable as a supplier for influencing them, but I can't control them. So our PRUB accountability thinking has triggered some very, very sobering conversations with purchasers. So thank you for the question on that one. I sympathise with your question, and I'm working on it.
Okay, thanks for that, Phil. Another question here from David Worley. Thank you, David. How has PRUB-thinking helped in increasing the quality of spending submissions and their approval rate?
Okay, PRUB-thinking originally came from a lot of work I used to do in New Zealand helping organisations apply for funding, particularly in the science sector. So I was involved in applications for probably between $50 and $100 million over a number of years. And people would put in a funding application and say, I'd like funding for project X, and it's going to generate benefits Y. And the funding organisations started to realise that a project didn't actually create a benefit, and they said, no, we want to know what the result is from the project. And they used to call the result an output. And instead of benefits, they used to use the word outcome. So the people applying for funding started saying, I'm going to produce this project that's going to produce this result that will generate this benefit or outcome. And then after a while, the funding agency realized that the result did not create the benefit. And they realized that the use creates the benefit. So the funding people applying for funding had to shift essentially to a project result use benefit funding application. And the discipline of creating that PRUB sequence meant that the quality of the funding applications increased. People couldn't just wildly wave their hands around and said, my project will create these benefits. First of all, they had to create a logical sequence, and a lot of them couldn't even do that. So the funding organization was able to eliminate a lot of that hand-waving funding applications. Those providers who could string together a logical sequence of PRUB, they then had to demonstrate that they had evidence that that was true. So the first step is, can you logically create the PRUB sequence? Second, where's your evidence that it's true? And thirdly, they had to demonstrate that the value of the benefits was greater than the cost of the projects plus the cost of the uses. So it provided a very disciplined structure for a funding application and a very disciplined structure for evaluating that application. Now, if it was a huge project, you might then go for, some of the far more sophisticated, better business case models. But at that initial funding application level, the PRUB sequence forced clarity around the claims that were being made for the funding application. So, David, I hope that addresses your question.
Okay, thanks very much, Phil. A couple more then. So why do you attribute separate accountability for measuring performance with respect to the success criteria?
I'm just wondering, can you clarify that question a little bit more?
I guess there's other questions around this. I'm struggling, Kik. This is from you. If you want to reword it, then please do.
Okay, I'll chip in perhaps. Monitoring accountability, there's two reasons for doing that. In fact, this is an issue I've got with a current client. Projects can be monitored for two reasons. One is for reporting to head office or reporting to somebody high up the tree. And very often an organisation, all they want to know is, did you achieve the benefit? And that might be fine for reporting purposes. It's no use at all for project management or for guiding performance management. And so the monitoring of projects and results, that's all about what we call lead indicators. If you monitor, is the project running on track, you can actually do something about it if it's not running on track. If you only measure the lag indicators, which is indicators of uses and benefits, it might be 2 years before you are able to monitor the benefit. And if you're not achieving the benefit, it's too late to go back and fix the projects and results. So we believe that whoever is actually running the projects and results should be themselves monitoring what they're doing and using that information in real time for project management. So those are the lead indicators. As we're getting into the lag indicators, the purchaser, it's going to start falling more and more into the purchaser's area of responsibility. Are the uses actually happening as we hope they would? Are the benefits actually happening as we hope they would? So those are lag indicators which, in our experience, tend to be more in the domain of the purchaser rather than the supplier. The supplier will be interested, but the purchaser is accountable for them. Does that address the question?
I think, yeah, I think you've interpreted it correctly, but I speak to Kik regularly, and I'll double check that that's to his satisfaction. A couple of ones around perhaps the use of language. So we've got a question here from Ravi: where does output and outcome sit within this model? And we do have others that are making a distinction between the scope of a project and the scope of a program. So any thoughts on those issues?
Okay, so if I do the output-outcome argument, if I talk to people about what's an output and what's an outcome, I get an enormous range of answers. My simplest answer is that a result is an output and a benefit is an outcome. but I've had people use the word outcome to describe a benefit, or an outcome to describe a use, or an outcome to describe a result. So I find the word outcome far too loose and non-specific. And that's why we use the words projects, results, uses and benefits with the first letter in uppercase to have the very specific meanings that we give to those words. So the project is something done to create an asset, which is a result. A use is the use of the asset, and the benefit is obviously the benefit that arises from the use of that asset. So I tend to avoid words like outputs and outcomes, but if you want, an outcome is generally a result. Sorry, an output is generally a result, an outcome is generally a benefit. So Merv, the second question, just remind me of that, please.
Yeah, this is really to do with the difference in role of the project and the program manager. If I throw in one statement here from Carl, which is the project manager may not be responsible for ensuring benefits are realized, but a program manager should monitor them after a project has been delivered. Would you agree with that assessment of the difference?
Yes, I would agree. Monitoring, though, you've heard the old phrase that you don't fatten the pig by measuring it or monitoring it. In my view, if you're going to monitor something, you want to monitor something that you can take an action on. So yes, you can monitor what's going on in the uses, and if the uses aren't happening, then there must be something missing in the results. And we've had this over and over again. Someone builds a cycleway and nobody uses it, and the reason they're not using it is there's nowhere to park the bikes. So the result of the cycleway was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. So PRUB-thinking is very useful for working out, is your set of results both necessary and sufficient? So you might have a cycleway and you might have bike stands, but nobody knows about it, so it still doesn't get used. So you might need, the results might need to be a cycleway and bike stands and a marketing campaign. Back to you, Merv.
Okay. Yeah, okay, and I can see that. I think those of us involved in both benefits and programs can see actually that a program is only ever a temporary organization. It will come to an end, and the monitoring needs to go on beyond that. So there's an issue, I think, in terms of to what extent the program manager can do that in this overall scheme from kind of your 9 steps. Just
well,
switching.
Merv, could I just respond to that? Yes, and I think this is something that's got to be agreed before you start the project or the program, is who is going to do that ongoing monitoring. And that's where in my little chart I've made that sort of ongoing monitoring of uses and benefits. I've put it in the domain of the purchaser. Now, as I said, that's the default position. The purchaser might ask the supplier to take over that role, but the default position is that the purchaser needs to do that ongoing monitoring and check that the program is actually enabling the users to create the benefits. Back to you, Merv.
Yeah, and for sure, I suppose we're talking about the purchaser being in different parts of the organization, and different aspects of purchase would be my understanding on it. If I could just, in a few minutes we've got remaining, switch over to, do you think PRUB could be used in prioritizing use cases within agile projects?
I believe it can be. I mean, this is a very off-the-cuff response. Yes, I mean, if you've very quickly produced a new product and a result and people are using it, monitoring that user very, very closely. Are they using it the way you expected them to use it? Are they getting the benefits that you expected them to generate? And maybe are other people getting benefits as a result of the use? So I often use PRUB for quite small projects, quite small experiments to just test, hey, is this working or not? So I would argue, yes, it can be used for very small projects all the way up to projects or programs like the high-speed link from London to Birmingham. I've used it with one client. This is a slightly amusing story where she had been trained in PRUB-thinking, and her husband came to her and said, I want to buy a new fishing rod. And she said to him, okay, you can have the fishing rod if you can PRUB it and show me what the benefits are. So he said, well, the project is buy the fishing rod, the result is I've got it, the use is I go fishing, and the benefit is that I catch the same number of fish as I always caught. And so she said, well, that's not a new benefit. Why do you need a new fishing rod? Because it's not actually going to help you catch any more fish. And he took a couple of days before he came back and said, actually, there is another benefit. I feel really good using the new fishing rod. And she said, well, go and buy it. So the benefit was actually quite what I suppose you'd call it a social benefit. And it was a real benefit. He felt really good using the new fishing rod. He didn't catch any more fish, but that didn't matter. So I think if you're going to use PRUB in an agile setting, be very open to discovering benefits that you hadn't expected to arise. Okay, back to you, Merv.
Okay, your fishing rod example reminds me of when I recently wanted to buy a new racing bike. I guess I found it difficult to use PRUB to justify it, but I kind of bought it anyway. But perhaps we'll, one final question, and then we'll bring this towards an end. If a project is part way through, is it still worthwhile reviewing uses and benefits?
Well, I certainly would. If you're only partway through the project, of course, all you can review is the predicted uses and benefits. And there's all sorts of ways of doing that, focus groups and trial runs and so on. So yeah, I mean, I always come back to uses and benefits in anything I'm doing and just keep checking, have I really understood the user? I'll just give another example on that. We did a major engagement review throughout the province of Canterbury on the use of water. And we were asking end users, what do they want to do with water? And people were saying, yeah, okay, I want to brush my teeth, I want to wash the car, I want to irrigate, I want to grow crops. And what we found is that people found it very easy to imagine what other people would do. They actually found it much harder to describe what they would actually do with water. And I think this is one of the biggest dangers we have as project managers and engineers like myself. We can see a result that obviously should be used, and so we bulldoze ahead and create the result, and we're terribly surprised when people don't use it. And I've been guilty of that as an engineer, and I guess I've really learned that before I build something that I fondly imagine and have a high level of confidence people will use, I have to actually ground truth it. Will they actually use it? And will they tell me they use it? And not only will they tell me, will they actually use it? So getting that evidence of uses is absolutely crucial. It's the gold in the PRUB system. So if you take one message away from this webinar, focus on uses, and when you understand uses, you will find just about everything else drops into place. Back to you, Merv.
Hey, thanks very much for that, Phil. What I think we'll do in bringing this to an end is to flick back across to the Mentimeter, and I know some of you are still filling that in, but I think you might be interested to see the results. So I'm just going to share my screen now. And Phil, you'll be able to see this as well. I think what words come to mind when you think of strategy? Well, direction is the clear winner on this, but plan and planning and leaderships have still come through very strongly. So that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you for that, folks. And then back to these strategy statements, and I guess I should have asked them separately afterwards, but you can see there that the kind of results that have come in, and from well over 100 views. So that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you for that.
Can I chip in on that?
Yes.
Those figures confirm the value of having project management people in your organisation, because they're much higher than what I experience in most organisations that don't have a lot of project managers involved. So I would say those numbers around 6 reflect the impact of project managers in those organisations. I think they're quite high results. So congratulations all round. Back to you.
Okay. And in fact, let's just flick back then to analyse the type of people that we've got on this webinar. So we've got a significant percentage in leadership roles, which we probably would expect to be quite strategically focused, project delivery, and then the change specialist community as well. So perhaps that it does confirm that. Okay, well let's then bring this to an end. I think all that really remains, unless you want a final word on this, Phil, is to thank you for your sacrificial giving in terms of this webinar. I think it's now something like 2:30 in the morning for you. So, so thank you once again.
Thank you, Merv, and thank you for the opportunity to engage with so many people over in the UK. So thank you, Merv, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.